Welcome to Courageous Women. Today I wanted to begin our broadcast with an announcement. We've decided it would be nice to allow other people to tell courageous stories about the women that are important in their lives, or some woman that they've heard about that made a big influence in their thinking. And so it doesn't have to be someone who was in the past. It could be a present person, someone who is courageous. And so if you're interested in contributing, I'll be putting my email address in the comments area, and you may send me a small script of or a small synopsis of what the story you would like to tell. And we will be happy to let you help us tell stories about courageous women. So this morning, I'm really excited to be able to tell you the story of a courageous woman from the very beginning pioneer days of the Uinta Basin. And her name is May Ruple. Actually, she was born in Sugar House area of Salt Lake City, and her christened name was Olive Mehetable Ruple, that was her married name, Kuhn. And when she was just 7 years old, her mother passed away, and her father moved her family up into the Evanston, Wyoming area. When she was 16 years old, she met a man named Henry Ruple, and he was from the East Coast. He was. There are several different records that all give different areas where he was born. Some say he was born in New Jersey. Some say that he was born in Pennsylvania. And it's interesting because if you use the primary sources that are available, they're different in the different sources. I believe that's because in those days record keeping was often by memory and not done exactly at the time when events happened. And so we'll find discrepancies in birth dates and in places where they were born. But he was from a large family, and he had two brothers. One was named Peter and one was named William. And all three of them, after the Civil War, came out to the Evanston area. And that is where he met May. She went by May, and that's what we'll call her throughout the rest of this experience today. There was an interesting story told by her daughter that she was told by an aunt who would have been her mother's sister, or sister-in-law. So one of their family members from the Ruples, she tells the story that the first time that she ever met May, it was, I'm going to go ahead and read it. The first time I saw your mother, I was 8 years old. It was after the Meeker massacre, and people were scared to death of the Indians, so scared that a watch was kept day and night. One day, the watcher hollered that there was dust in the west. Everybody started running. Men grabbed their guns and ammunition, and women and children ran inside the fort. The men on top of the fort started yelling down to the others that they could see 3 riders riding as fast as possible toward the fort. Surely there were Indians in their pursuit. Then one guy yelled that one of the riders was a woman riding side saddle, and boy, could she ride. As the riders got closer, Alice looked through a peephole and saw this woman dressed in a black riding habit with a tight-fitted jacket adorned with jet-colored buttons from her waist to her chin and a long flowing skirt. At the waist was a tailored sash. She wore a derby-style hat, which was tied with bright-colored blue veil that hung down her back. Alice said, I was so taken in with her sight, I forgot all about the Indians. When the riders rode inside the fort, people gathered around expecting to hear the worst. Instead, all three riders, May, Hank, and another man, burst into laughter. They had come across the sagebrush flat just as fast as they could, just to scare the hell out of those folks at the fort. It sounds like May was quite a character. After she married Hank up in Evanston, they moved down to Vernal, and at the time she had her first child, and his name was also Hank, went by Hod in later years. And he was born up in Evanston, and she rode horseback, side saddle, all the way from Evanston to Vernal when she moved here. She really must have been a good rider. Hank was a sawyer in the area. He would build a sawmill, and he would saw wood for the pioneers in this area, and was instrumental in sawing the wood for Fort Thornburg. He was a very industrious man, and there was one time when the agent over in White Rocks had to leave the area for a while, and Hank and May went over there to help out for the few months that he would be gone. And she worked in the boarding school for the Ute children, and he helped in the agency. After that was over, they went ahead and found a place called Island Park on the Green River, and I'm going to switch the camera so you can see a picture of that area. It is now a part of the Dinosaur National Monument, and you can go down there. It's called Island Park. It's so beautiful, and it is very remote. If you drive out there, you'll find that especially the last 15 miles are a very slow route because it's all secondary road system and dirt, and there's times when if it's raining that it will wash away the road. They actually had to build that road, and there are a few stories of how difficult that was to get a good road down into that area. May had 4 children before that grew to adulthood. This is a picture of her family, and in their older years, if you look, you can see she had 2 daughters and 2 sons. And May was supposedly a very small woman, about 90 pounds, and just full of vim and vigor, and her family loved her dearly. We have several pictures of the family through the years as there's a sheep wagon. The family did get into some sheep ranching. They did cattle ranching in a bit, but after that they went into sheep. They also, like I said, were sawyers, and this is a picture of one of the mills and the family when they were out there working on the mill. I love this picture of May. As she got older, she was still working just as hard as when she was young, and was a very spirited woman. They had a very interesting year in 1916. They moved out to the ranch in 1883, and they left the ranch to their son. I'm trying to remember exactly the year, but it would have been somewhere around that, just before that time, I believe. And then they moved to another area just where, on Little Brush Creek, which is up where their ranch is under Stanaker Dam now. And they were always in remote areas. They tell the story of one time when Hank went back to help over in White Rocks, and he was only supposed to be gone for a couple of days, and he ended up being gone for a couple of months because they recruited him to do a job, and she didn't have any information of where he was. I wonder what kind of fears went through her heart when she was considering that. Before I go on to that 1916 year, I should tell you a couple stories about when they lived at Island Park. And they had a friend who, she was the wife of the man that Jones Hole is named after. And she was struggling in her marriage and left her husband. And wherever she was, they went up to help her do some haying. And May and she both had infant children, and she had both of the babies had been put in the shed to take a nap, and Hank was down in the field haying when her husband, her estranged husband, came, and he was angry, and there was another man with them up there near the houses, and he tried to stop him, and they said he ripped him to shreds with a knife. And then he ran over to the shed and grabbed the baby and got on his horse and started riding off. Well, he grabbed the wrong baby. He actually grabbed May's baby, and so she was frantic and ran to the fields and to get Hank. And Hank took after, had to unhitch the horses and got on it and caught up to him. And he said, "Why are you taking my baby?" And he said, "This isn't your baby, it's mine." And he said his baby was a boy. Hank's baby was a boy, May and Hank's, but Mr. Jones's baby was a little girl, so he had to actually undress the baby to prove that he had taken the wrong baby. May and Mr. Jones's ex-wife had taken the man who had gotten cut up with the knife, and they got a great big bag of flour that was in the area and put him on that flour and wrapped him, and were able to stop the bleeding enough that the man did survive. Quite courageous of these two women. Another story is told, and I'm going to move the camera a little bit and come up here so that you can see this picture. Galloway came to Island Park, and he built his boat there and said he was going to go up the river, and he was going to go down the river for a short ways, and then they were going to just leave the boat there, and that if May and Hank wanted that boat, they could have it. They would just have to hike up until they found the boat, and then they thought that would be great. They lived right on the river, and it would be really wonderful to have a boat to be able to maneuver in the river. So they went hiking, and they went on up the river until they actually found the boat. And they also, again, at this time, had an infant with them, and so it was mom and dad, and one little baby got into that boat and headed down the green. It was quite a precarious journey, and May was said to have been very grateful that they were able to make it through that experience. Wasn't quite so excited about having a boat after that. So this is what the Galloway boats looked like. I wanted to show just a couple more pictures that people have taken through the years of the Island Park area before I move on to the story. Supposedly, this tree out there that is the largest and oldest cottonwood in the state of Utah, or one of the largest, oldest ones. Through the years, many of the branches have fallen off. Okay, and I'm going to go on to that 19. So remember I told you that there were three brothers who came. There was William, and there was Hank, and there was a Peter. And William and Peter both served in the Civil War. Well, there was a point where Hank applied for a pension under Peter's name from the Civil War. And in the year 1816, he and May were indicted on fraud charges because they said that he had applied for this pension under a false name. It was in the papers all over Utah. Huge amounts of controversial things were said. Stories were written that were total opposites of each other. There was one time when they would say he was Hank and Peter, but there was other times when they would say he was Peter versus Hank. May and he both made statements that it was true that he was actually Peter. There was one of their sisters that came from back east who said that she didn't remember them as her brothers. Are kind of vague to her, but there was a time when Peter was called Hank when she was a little girl. And there was just William actually married May's sister, and they lived in Vernal for a while and then moved down to Bakersville in California. And his son said that on his deathbed, he told him that his Uncle Hank, the one that he knew as Uncle Hank in Vernal, wasn't really Hank, he was Peter, but not to tell anybody. There was a lot of things brought up in the trial, things like she was married to Hank and then he disappeared, and so Peter took over being her husband. In some articles, they call her a common law wife. In others, she was, they were just lying, and she was really married to Hank and he was Henry. It's just a really interesting story. If you go through the newspapers at the time, it's just fascinating how every story is different, just like our news is today. They were convicted by a jury trial of peers. And eventually Hank was sentenced to, I believe it was 16 months at Leavenworth Prison, and he was supposed to leave in a certain period of time. When he came back to Vernal, he was devastated. He was 70 years old when this trial occurred, and he said he could hardly hear, he could hardly speak. He made a will when they were ready to send him to Leavenworth because he didn't think he would survive the sentence. The people in Vernal loved the Ruples, and they started making petitions that they would be pardoned. And I could not ever find any. There was like a paper, he's leaving tomorrow. There was, just to read you one of the articles in the paper, it says, Henry Ruple, pioneer ranchman of Vernal, will be in Salt Lake Monday for sentence in the United States court on 9 counts of perjury in connection with charges of having defrauded the government out of pension monies. It was learned yesterday in the office of the United States District Attorney. Ruple was convicted of posing as his brother Peter Ruple, who served in the Civil War, and of collecting pension money in the latter's name. He was found guilty by a jury in the federal court nearly 4 weeks ago and was permitted to return to his home to adjust his estate prior to appearance for a sentence. So it was just a really big story. There was never any retractions in any place, but so the trials started in January and they ran through about May was when he was convicted. And then in late July is when he was supposed to go to Leavenworth. And then you find a little script in the newspaper. The government has dropped charges against Henry and May Ruple in about November of that year. And that was the only sentence. And you don't see any evidence of it in Vernal. That was a paper in Salt Lake City. And so whether he ever went to Leavenworth or not is lost in history. There's no evidence or any family stories or any written history that would tell you if he actually spent time in Leavenworth. I just thought that was such an interesting story. There's one more story I wanted to tell you about once they had moved up to the Stanaker area. In the Stanaker, during that time, it was in about 1920, they had their new ranch up there, and they had purchased a car, but they were still using wagons. And one day, Henry was following May down the hill. She was in a wagon in front of him, and he was in the car, and the car's brakes were failed. And the car kept going faster and faster until he hit into the wagon where May was. It threw May out onto the ground, and they said that she broke her arm above the elbow in 3 places, one being up on her shoulder. It cracked every rib on her left side, and she had a terrible wound on her head and on her leg. And yet May went on to recover and live a very full life. In fact, May lived for just shy. She died in May. If she had made it to September, she would have been 100 years old. And in her older age, she did some exciting things. She always wanted, for her 95th birthday, she was, whoa, excuse me for the sound. She went on a trip down the river with Buzz Hatch. When she was a little bit older than that, she took her first air flight, and she went down to California. She lived a full, exciting life. I did want to take you to one more area in the museum because we are celebrating the vote of women. I'm just going to let you look at the museum as I walk through. We do have her in one more spot in the museum. This is a picture of May in a voting booth. It says in 1896, May voted for the first time. She hitched her horses to the surrey and gathered voters, taking them to the election polls. She never missed a general election again and was still casting her vote at the age of 98. A remarkable woman from the Uintah County. I hope you enjoyed her story today. See you next week.